Hello and welcome to the 12th and final Act4Share discussion group. Today, our panel of over 60s are reflecting on their experience of education. There have been far-reaching developments in British education in the last 60 years. For example, the school leaving age was only raised to 16 as recently as 1972. Have today's older citizens benefited or suffered from these changes? Access to further education appears to have improved for all in this period. The more recent introduction of tuition fees seems likely to affect this, however. There is also the expansion of lifelong learning to consider. Will today's younger citizens benefit from this evolving area, where the new interconnectivity is leading to exciting innovations in teaching methods and the reach of educational resources? Let's see what the panel have to say.
Early days, I suppose, was to remember that firstly, education was initially only for people up to 14, then 15, then 16. The vast number of people who were in education were in state secondary moderns. There was a very small number of people, probably 10% maximum in grammar schools. There was a very, very small proportion of people in private schools in those days. At university, less than 8% of the population went to university, and therefore if you did graduate you were immediately part of an elite, certainly an educated or an elite. And postgraduates, which are now quite prevalent around the place, were very, very rare indeed, and were just for academics. So it was much more elitist. But within that, there were also enormous divisions that were quite prevalent of discussions in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s about the division between arts and sciences. And where, as we separated our knowledge from the age of 16, you didn't have a baccalaureate system. So basically there was scientists and engineers had very little to do with social scientists and arts graduates. And then aside from that were the enormous difference between sort of university education and vocational education. But that wasn't in those days called vocational education, it was called apprenticeships. And apprenticeships were the rock bottom basis for each country's economy being able to be productive and to be competitive with one another. And the big arguments was we never put enough effort compared to, say, the Germans or the French or other Europeans into training enough apprentices up. Far too many people were unskilled. But by these days' standards, those apprenticeships were golden. You would spend 3-4 years, you'd be trained on the job, you'd go to day release courses, you'd have formal qualifications, and when you were qualified, that was in itself a golden introduction to a world where you had job security and where you were well paid and well respected. And not just things like plumbing and construction, but in all of the trades that made up the productive Britain that existed before Thatcher's counter-revolution. What would your experience of that be, in your understanding?
Well, my experience of education, I kind of went through the transition from the grammar school secondary modern system to the comprehensive system. So the year after I left school, that was the first year they brought in comprehensive kids to the grammar school that I attended. I think the comprehensive education system is a good idea, and that it was a progressive move in a way to actually stop using the 11 plus. There was this thing where you took your 11 plus at 10 or 11 years old, and in a sense your results at that age decided the whole of the rest of your life, decided whether or not you were intelligent enough supposedly to go to grammar school, or if, as you say, you went to a secondary modern. And in a sense those two institutions were preparing you for two very different kinds of life that you'd be expected to be able to live. And so I think the idea of a comprehensive education where people's abilities people develop at different rates, and so therefore it's wrong to kind of classify people that young, in my opinion. So I was kind of ideologically, I think comprehensive education is a good idea, but because it's operating within a system where you've got private education as well, it can never actually sort of fulfil its true promise, is the way I'd see it, you know. And the other thing I'd like to say is that our generation, that grew up in the 60s, my generation, took education for granted, in a sense. There was never any question that you'd have to pay to go to university, or that education would leave you in debt in some way. And there's been the revolutionary change in my lifetime has been that to get further education, you now have to take it costs you money. And I think it's really unfair for the current generation to be expected to have to pay and for an education that we took for granted was actually your right as a citizen of the country. So that's something that makes me very angry.
I remember thinking the Minister of Education, big thug from New Labour, Clark, who was the beneficiary of grammar school education, of university education, and he went to Oxbridge, so therefore he also was able to do the classics and the arts. And he then turned around and said, no, people get a benefit from it and therefore they should pay for it, and that the only function of education is not to learn, particularly not to learn how to question, but it is just to learn to work. And therefore there is no role anymore for and that's when they started cancelling life drawing classes and anything which was actually good for your soul, good for your creativity, but wasn't actually productive, was ruthlessly cut. And this was from a man who had himself gained from all of that, which I thought, and I still think, that man is an obscenity.
Yes, well, I certainly benefited from all of that. I mean, I was actually in the part of County Durham where I was in primary school. My year at school was the first year that didn't have to sit the 11 plus. So we were just assessed on the year's work. But then we were divided off, and those of us who were deemed to be grammar school material were sent to what had been the grammar school, although it was a church school, so it was funny because within Darlington it had gone virtually comprehensive, but it was still taking selected pupils from towns and villages outside, so it was a right mix, and also it was single sex, so it was called multilateral rather than comprehensive. But it was lucky that I did, because Darlington in the 60s, I've talked about this in a different discussion on music, I really benefited from some very progressive policies around music education in the late 60s, early 70s, which the like of which we just don't see these days. Got a free Oxbridge education, as you said, Dominic, and it didn't come out saddled with debt that I would never be able to pay off. And yes, we did think of it as a right. If you'd done well enough to be accepted by the university, then it was your right to be educated to that level. And
I think now what's interesting is a lot of education, real education, learning collectively and for the sake of it, is now going on more in voluntary activities. I mean, look at the third age universities, which have sprouted up all over the country and across Europe now, in which people will want to learn about line dancing or learn a new language, or not for any reason to do with work or earning money, but to socialise and to expand your mind and to learn to question and to express your creative urges. And I think it is so sad that all of that has been taken out of the whole drive for the provision of education. And on top of that, even the education that our children are getting is geared solely around passing exams. It is a regime of permanent testing in which the auditors and the inspectors are the ones driving what could be creative impulses by teachers and unleashing the creativity of the children. And it's no wonder 40% of young teachers after they get their qualification, they do their probationary year. The last figures were 40% of them give up teaching, not because they don't want to teach, but because of the onerous conditions that they've been put under by these small, narrow-minded, Stalinist approaches towards tick-box evaluation.
I think for adult education, it's very different now. And, the good side of the kind of digital revolution as far as education is concerned is that it's really increased accessibility to, in some ways, top-class teaching. So there's these awful things called webinars. I don't know if you've heard about this. Yes. So it's, and I think that's wonderful because it means anybody can access top-class kind of discussions, educational resources in a way that they wouldn't have been able to before. So I think there's a lot more scope for kind of autodidacticism and teaching yourself, becoming, for people to follow their interests and educationally kind of find their own route through things.
Well, of course, that's interesting that was the basis of the internet. The internet was by academics wanting to exchange ideas and collectivise knowledge.
Yes.
And of course that was what the great hope was, until human nature came along, and then 50% of all of the initial of the content wasn't useful and academic and education. It was pornography.
But I still think there's that idealism still there, and there, for sure there's a lot of horrible stuff, but that early idealism of the internet, I think it still exists, and so people are trying to kind of make positive things happen.
Well, don't you think Wikipedia is a great example?
Well, exactly, and just the fact that people can communicate with each other, it brings lots of terrible things, but it also brings lots of things that perhaps we don't appreciate enough because there's a lot of focus on the negative, especially from the point of view of older people. Sort of think, well, it's not, there's all this, the internet and mass communication seems to have kind of created all this stuff that's really unpleasant and horrible, holds up a kind of mirror to society or to humanity. But I suppose you've got to keep, as an older person, you've got to keep kind of reminding yourself that in the mirror you see the good thing as well as the bad.
Well, there are now literally millions of older people who are signing up to university courses, university of the third age and local colleges, as well as the Open University.
Yeah, and so if you think that
was an early...
Well, the Open University was the start, wasn't it?
Yes. Well, if you think that education is a value for its own sake, then that's got to be a good thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because people are much more able and it's much easier to be able to access those things.